Hi, my name is Alex Traiman. I'm sitting here with Ruthie Blum. We are in the JNS studios here in our Jerusalem headquarters, and we are discussing the Israeli elections. Yesterday, Israelis went to the polls to pick for the fifth time in just about 3 years who would be their political leaders, and in particular, whether or not Benjamin Netanyahu would be the prime minister. We brought you the exit poll results last night. We brought everybody the results, which looked like Netanyahu was on the edge of forming a right-wing coalition. But as we had seen in several of the other election cycles, an early result that looked positive for Netanyahu later during the actual counting of the paper ballots showed a continued deadlock, electoral deadlock. And here we have something which is a phenomenon that is different than those previous iterations of the Israeli elections. And it looks like with over 75% of the votes counted, these paper ballots counted by hand, that not only did the exit results hold with Netanyahu's bloc projected to win 62 seats, but actually that the right-wing bloc has strengthened in the counting, and Netanyahu's bloc may grow to as large as 65 seats out of 120, which is nothing short of a definitive victory for Netanyahu and the right wing.
It's particularly definitive when you consider that the anti-Netanyahu bloc, without the anti-Zionist parties in the mix and added to the count, is way less, is only 50 seats or something like that. So it's
if you look at the breakdown, so if the count holds as it is right now, Netanyahu and his right-wing allies, or the Religious Zionism Party, and the two Orthodox parties, Shas and the United Torah Judaism Party, have 65 mandates. The left-wing parties in Israel, which are led by Yair Lapid and include Benny Gantz, and also the Labor Party, which was a traditional ruling party in Israel, and the Meretz Party, which failed as of now to get across the electoral threshold and will have 0 seats. The left wing in Israel has only 45 seats. So when you look at right wing versus left wing, you have a 20-seat gap, which is nothing short of a landslide in terms of Israeli electoral politics. And then if you look at if you add on the Ram party, the Arab Israeli party, that was the first time an Arab party has ever joined in a coalition government, who joined together with Yair Lapid and former Prime Minister Naftali Bennett to create that change bloc that sent Netanyahu to the opposition. If you add Ram and the total they've received to the left wing, the parties that were incumbent, so to speak, in this last coalition had 50 seats. So again, you have a 15-seat gap between Netanyahu and his bloc versus the bloc that was in power. So it's nothing short of a very, very clear and overwhelming, decisive result from the Israeli electorate. How'd that happen?
Oh, well, it happened for many reasons. I would say chief among them that the left in Israel has been failing for years. And the only reason that we've had 5 rounds of elections, making it appear as though Israelis are split down the middle, is because of electoral politics and of a few individual Knesset members who hate Netanyahu so much that overrides, that has trumped, so to speak, trumped any ideology they may have had previously. But the fact is that the public has been a conservative public. Now, that's not to say the public is ultra-Orthodox, or what the left loves. The left loves to call us the extreme right. No, we are center. We're in the center. We're pluralistic. We are traditional. We are nationalistic. We are patriotic. We care about Jewish values. We care about the national anthem. And we care very, very much about peace. And we're disappointed in our so-called partners that never were partners, and thrilled with our new partners in the Abraham Accords. That's who we are. And the left repeatedly has rejected all of these values. And by the way, not always, not traditionally in Israel, we got to make that clear, that the old school left in Israel that were really responsible for building the country, they weren't woke leftists. They were, the labor Zionist movement was not some far left thing. They had they were socialists, yes, but very patriotic and cared very much about the land of Israel and the state of Israel and establishing the state. And it's morphed into something that's more American-like.
Right, more progressive.
Progressive and European also. There's a lot of the European influence there.
Exactly. Most of the Israeli left sees Israel as being a secular extension of Europe on the Eastern Mediterranean, right? And the people that came out to vote and put Netanyahu back into office, they view Israel as a uniquely Jewish state, a nationalist state, a state that has a unique language, a unique culture, a unique religion, a nation ultimately that can have allies but stands alone, and is not part of this globalist wave that has taken over most of Western Europe and is pushing into the United States and much of the Western world as well. And you said that many of the left-wingers in the Israeli government across the spectrum and in the media, they call Netanyahu and his alignment a far-right alignment. And have you noticed a trend whereby everybody across the political spectrum, no matter where they sit, gets positioned maybe 2 pegs to the right of where they actually are?
Yeah.
Like, for example, Yair Lapid, who was challenging
center.
Netanyahu.
They call him
so
center.
He's a centrist, even though he's the head of the progressive left in Israel.
That's right.
And then, the Meretz party, which is the far extreme left-wing
Far
party, they're a left-wing party.
Right, they're left-wing.
Benny Gantz, who sits with Gadi Eisenkot and are both members of the left wing. Yes, they do have some former Likud members in the party. Because of that, they're called a center-right alliance, even though...
which is insane. They
are
not center-right.
They're a center-left alliance.
Exactly.
Right? Netanyahu is called, a hard right-winger, even though any right-winger will tell you that Netanyahu is probably a centrist. Yeah, and
yes.
then those that are called the extreme right, well, yeah, they're on the right wing flank, of course, but everybody gets knocked.
Absolutely, and one of the
right.
reasons is, well, there are a few reasons, but one of them has to do with sovereignty. The word sovereignty for different people means different things. For some people, it means extending sovereignty to Judea and Samaria, for example. And that does mean that. And we've extended sovereignty to the Golan Heights, for example. But the issue of sovereignty as a Jewish nation, that we are the Jewish people and we have sovereignty in our land, which is what we're doing here in Israel in the first place. It's why we're here, and it's why we have a state. It's not just because the Nazis tried to kill us and then the UN said, okay, fine, you can have your state. And I think that as generations go and there's less and less education, the narrative of sovereignty, the word sovereignty has become a bad word on the left. And that has connotations of occupation, colonialism, things like that, which are actually is the opposite of what Jews are doing in the land of Israel.
Right. Israel's gotten pegged onto the entire wrong side of the intersectionality and
completely wrong side.
Critical race theory debate. I mean, Israel, comes out of, first we're the indigenous people in the land. We're speaking an ancient language, in our ancient homeland, in our biblical homeland. We, in modern times, came out of the ashes of a legitimate horrific genocide in Europe where over 6 million of our people were marched into gas chambers. And then on the other side, we come out of the largest ethnic cleansing that has ever taken place in the last 100 years, where over 800,000 Jews were forcibly evicted from their homes in Arab countries, Middle Eastern countries, and yet coming out of both sides, both a real ethnic cleansing and a real genocide, somehow we got positioned onto the oppressor side,
Exactly. Exactly.
and when you talk about sovereignty, what you see is that in the previous years, the 12 years of Netanyahu's second tenure, now he's about to have a third tenure, he did establish Israeli sovereignty. And what did that lead to? That led to, by and large, reduced terror activity, like greater security for Israelis here inside the country. And also, as you mentioned just a few minutes ago, the signing of these incredible normalization agreements with 4 Muslim majority nations. And yet, in the 1 year in which Lapid and Bennett and the left managed to send Netanyahu into the opposition, the concept of sovereignty has gone by the wayside. And what have we seen? We've seen the slowing down of the momentum of the Abraham Accords, and we've seen an influx in terror, especially in Judea and Samaria, but also inside Israeli population centers.
No, there's no question about that. There's also another element to this election, and I think that hasn't been spoken about enough in the context, by the way, of what side of the woke adjectives you're on, and that is that there's also a class struggle in Israel. Okay, and and people like to call it race. They say you're a racist, but what they really mean is class. In the United States, there's a similar thing going on, and I think there's a population in Israel that feels disenfranchised, and they tend to be the Mizrahim from North African countries. And what happened? We thought that this debate, this issue between Ashkenazim and Mizrahim.
Right. The Ashkenazi is like Jews from European descent, and Mizrahim, Jews that lived in Muslim majority countries.
Exactly. Now, it used to be a huge issue here, and many people think it totally disappeared, and mainly because there's intermarriage. It's hard to know, your kids marry Mizrahim marry. There are Ethiopians married to Ashkenazim. There's a whole, and it's true, there is a melting pot. However, the class struggle also comes about politically, and in the following way. The Mizrahim traditionally, because they came from Muslim majority countries where they were abused, they never trusted in the Arab, they never trusted in a peace process with Arabs who were out to kill them. The Ashkenazim, on the other hand, who didn't live among Arabs, the Ashkenazim were focused more on the white.
They lived in Christian majority
exactly.
countries.
So they're focused on white people, white oppressors like Nazis. Okay, and the Mizrahim not, and that's one thing. Now, it's true that those Mizrahim tend to be, they have kids and grandchildren and some great grandchildren here who didn't grow up, who all grew up in the state of Israel. But the class struggle that lies underneath does have to do, one of the things that we're talking about is voter turnout. There was a huge voter turnout yesterday. But Netanyahu was worried because in places that are generally Likud majority, neighborhoods or towns, they have a low voter turnout. And the answer and the reason is, as it happens all over the world, that people who are in the underclass tend to vote less than people in the elitists, the educated, the upper classes tend to vote in high numbers. And one of the reasons that people who feel disenfranchised don't vote is they say, okay, it's raining. What am I going to, nothing will change. It's raining or it's too hot outside or something. I'm not going to go to vote when how is my life is not going to change. My groceries are still going to be expensive or whatever.
Sure.
And
especially, and this is the 5th time of elections. I went
right.
out to vote 4 times.
Yeah, exactly.
But
they felt encouraged by not just by Netanyahu, but this sort of surge of popularity of the religious Zionists headed by Bezalel Smotrich and Itamar Ben-Gvir. So infused energy into them. Now it's interesting because Itamar Ben-Gvir is a Mizrahi Jew, and Bezalel Smotrich is an Ashkenazi Jew, and actually in their party there is a cultural divide as well.
Right. Well, the
Where
Religious Zionism Party is a technical block of smaller parties that
That's
came
right.
together because they knew that if they didn't come together, that one or more of them might not cross the minimum electoral threshold. So they banded together because of
That's
some
right.
ideological similarities, and they did not only did they manage to get across the electoral threshold, but they surged in the elections and had a
Surged.
historic result for religious Zionist and nationalist parties, getting 14 seats. As I think they've never received so many votes. And
That's right. And the idea, so because of that, now the left in Israel, and by the way, in the United States too, and elsewhere in the world, are saying this is terrible. Now we're going to have a racist government. I heard it compared to Iran. I heard it compared to The Handmaid's Tale. I heard it compared, you know, the ignorance is astounding. The ignorance on the part of people who have no clue about who these people are. These people, specifically Itamar Ben-Gvir and Bezalel Smotrich, and generally these people as, let's say, observant Jews who are not reform and conservatives. It is astounding. The ignorance is astounding. And it is true that nationalism has surged in many countries in the world right now. And rightly so, because there is a response. It's a response to this horrible sort of erasing of all kinds of sort of normal common sense values that used to be taken for granted. Now, I mean, that we are even arguing about whether a 9-month-old fetus is a baby or not. You wouldn't have been able to fathom this not long ago.
Right. So you definitely saw a surge of votes, both in the Religious Zionism Party, but also in the Orthodox parties. I think one of the major surprises of the election was that the two Orthodox parties, who had been polling at 15 seats collectively, may have as many as 18 or 19 seats when the final votes get counted. And the religious sectors of society are growing in terms of their population, but over the last several elections, we have not seen their electoral representation growing along with the growth of the population. And I think that they've looked and they've seen very clearly, well, what can happen if the left wing gets into power. And as you described, I think very accurately, that the left wing of today in Israel is very different than the left wing of Israel's history, of Israel's past, even just 2 decades ago, really promoting very different values, promoting Western European values, promoting Democratic Party and progressive American values, and trying to import those into Israel. And the strong voting tallies from the religious sectors and the religious Zionist sectors, and even the traditional Mizrahi sectors, where people are generally, even if they're not very observant, do still care a lot about Jewish traditions, and
Very much so.
and they have basically stood up and rejected, with very clear showing, this progressive wave that is sweeping across many of Israel's Western allies.
And interestingly, even a lot of young people, some first-time voters who just turned 18, but young people who wouldn't be considered typical voters of a religious Zionist party, including in Tel Aviv, places where then these are not all religious youth. Now, an interesting anecdote happened on Election Day. Now, it's just one anecdote, but it kind of is a metaphor for what was going on. And this was at a Chabad table set up outside somewhere where Chabad does this. It helps and asks men if they would like to put on phylacteries, tefillin. A Meretz activist with a T-shirt with the party name on his chest, went up to the table and he grabbed the tefillin, and he was told, wait, put it down. Don't. He grabbed it, waved it around, and then rubbed it on his crotch. Now, afterwards, Meretz, the whole party,
And of course, this was captured on video,
was
so
captured.
it's going
today,
viral on.
so it went viral on video, and the police took him in for questioning, and the head of Meretz dissociated herself from it. She said, no, this is offensive and it's terrible.
And I'd like to say, by the way, that I've seen pictures of several Meretz activists actually donning tefillin after that happened.
Right.
So, you know,
Right. No, this was one guy, it was disgusting, and everybody agreed across the board that it was disgusting. But the reason I said it's a metaphor is that the ease with which a young Israeli guy would come up to a Chabad table and grab the tefillin all together, when traditionally this is a country where even if you're not somebody who lays tefillin, you're not somebody who goes to synagogue, there's a kind of built-in respect that we have. And this was just, I mean, it was a symbol, even though it was not pervasive, but it was a snapshot of something that has been going on under the surface. There have been, we have a minister who was, or somebody who was heading the Knesset Foreign Affairs and Defense Committee, saying that if Netanyahu wins this election, all women are going to have to wear head coverings, and brought even women in TV studios. It was like, really? Where did you get that from? And then he began to compare him to the Nazis, saying, this is how Nazis were, Hitler was elected in democratic elections. You have a member of our government saying that Hitler was elected in democratic elections because you don't like your rivals. This is unthinkable.
And I want to talk a little bit about the efforts to try to delegitimize the Netanyahu government and to call Netanyahu's coalition partners racists. Israel's been fighting a delegitimization campaign that's been organized by the Palestinian Authority in Ramallah and has invaded many parts of the international community, including most universities are in the Western world, including in some corporations that have decided to boycott, divest, or sanction Israeli companies. What type of damage does it do when you have this internal rhetoric that turns ridiculous, and you have members of Israel and members of the Israeli press calling Israel's democratically elected leaders illegitimate and racist? What damage does that cause the state of Israel diplomatically?
It's caused terrible damage, but this isn't just from today. That's the good news in a way. When Menachem Begin was elected in 1977, he came to power, and the Labor Party, this broke since the beginning of the state, the Labor Party had controlled the Israeli government. When Menachem Begin rose to power, Israelis said he's Mussolini, and this is the end of Israel. They said this. The left in Israel really has no shame when it comes to attacking its political rivals and does not care about its standing in the international community. I notice that the left likes to attack Netanyahu for supposedly damaging Israel's image in the international community. The left has accused Netanyahu of causing a rift between Democrats and Republicans about Israel, that he turned it into a partisan issue from a bipartisan one. Now, this is nonsense, but notice that they care very much about Israel's standing in the international community in this respect. But they don't care that they are damaging Israel in the eyes of the international community when they call a democratically elected government racist.
Can you tell me, how do you think that a strong and stable right-wing government led by Netanyahu, how does that actually strengthen the state of Israel?
Well, I think that, first of all, it'll strengthen it. You have to understand now the fear of Ben Gvir and Smotrich, the religious Zionist party. it's got big numbers. It's got maybe 14 seats. We don't know yet completely, but let's say 14 seats.
About 80% of the votes counted, and it looks like they're
Right, so
holding
let's
at
say they
14
have 14.
seats. Maybe they'll lose one. It could be 13 seats.
Or maybe they'll gain one when the soldiers' votes are counted. We don't know. But Likud is still double that, if not more than double that. Likud, it will be Netanyahu running this government. It will not be Ben Gvir running this government. He will have influences on it. And by the way, some of the policies that he and Smotrich have put forth are policies that any self-respecting secular Israeli could jump on. Okay, now I know there's concern. Why is there concern? There's concern that these two are against gay marriage, that these two are against public transportation on Shabbat. But let me tell you something. First of all, Israel has never had gay marriage in Israel. Israel doesn't even have normal, secular marriage. But what it does is recognize any marriage. The state recognizes any marriage that is legal in another country. It will be legal in the state of Israel. It will not be considered legal by the rabbinate. Okay, what's new about this? Nothing. The idea that somehow these guys are going to come in and turn Israel into some kind of theocracy is insane.
So it's more about protecting status quos that exist and have existed for decades that progressives were trying to change.
And another thing is to safeguard Jewish education in the Jewish state. Do you know that it turns out that this government was eliminating the need to study Tanakh,
the Bible,
studies, and the Torah and the Bible in schools. The left was screaming that the ultra-Orthodox parties said we don't need to study core curricula like English and math, right? So the left went ballistic over this. Meanwhile, quietly, they were eliminating, this government that we have just ousted was eliminating the need to study Bible in Israeli schools.
Right, and one of the reasons why that's so important is because the Jewish hold on the land of Israel is elucidated at length in the Tanakh, in the Torah. If you can't understand why Jews might want to live in a place like Hebron, where the Cave of the Patriarchs is located, where only 500 Jews live in a city of 250,000 Arabs, unless you understand the Tanakh and you read the Tanakh. Once you read that, you say, oh, wait a second, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and their wives are buried here, and this is important to our heritage. And if you don't have that biblical study in school, then your connection to the land is eliminated.
Then you believe the lies that Jews just sort of came over from Europe. The Holocaust survivors just sort of came over from Europe and appropriated someone else's land.
Right.
Aside from that, the Bible is great literature. And as is the case with, I think, certainly students in the United States. There's been a lot of dumbing down of our own language. Now, as it happens, the Bible is in Hebrew, and Israeli children speak Hebrew. It's an enriching book, aside from everything else, and not learning it is robbing them, and especially when you learn it at a young age, it becomes ingrained, and it doesn't mean that you then have to pray according to it. All secular schools taught it. It is not a question of whether you're using it as a prayer book.
Right. Now, a lot of the left-wing opponents of Netanyahu looking at this government, they're saying that this is a narrow right-wing alliance. But in many ways, if you look at its constellation, it may ultimately be much more stable. Can you tell me why you think a narrow right-wing alliance can be much more stable for Netanyahu than if he would somehow find a way to govern from the center?
Well, for one thing, as we've seen in the past year, not only year, in the past 3 years, really, we've seen what happens when you have a mishmash of ideologically disparate parties. This idea that we need a wide unity government because we're pluralistic and we need to have, a cross section. It doesn't work. It's not that, of course, the government is the government of all the people. Of course, that's true in any country. Of course, Netanyahu is not just my prime minister now. He's also the prime minister of the left-wingers who hate him. That the point is, how do you function in a government when you need to pass a law, when you need to, and right now there are many very, very important issues at stake, among them, chief among them, what to do about this awful judiciary that needs reforming, that it has overstepped its bounds. It has taken over the job of the legislature, and it's outrageous. And the people accusing accusing Netanyahu and Ben Gvir and Smotrich of doing something undemocratic by wanting to revamp the judicial system. It's just the opposite. It's the judicial system that has become undemocratic.
Right. The checks and balances that you would expect in a normal democracy have been demolished. And one of the episodes where we saw that very clearly was after the third election cycle, where we had an electoral deadlock, and the Supreme Court actually came in and violated Knesset protocol by forcing the then Speaker of the Knesset, Yuli Edelstein, to resign his post before the opposition was able to form a government. And the reason why they wanted him to resign his post was that if the opposition could get that spot, then they could advance legislation that would retroactively invalidate Netanyahu as the prime minister. And it was a Supreme Court ruling that actually forced Edelstein to resign against the legislative procedures.
Right.
And you can also look at this last government that Yair Lapid managed to cobble together. He had won only 17 seats, which was 13 seats less than Likud had won in the last election. Likud had 30 in that election.
Well, wait a second. That's a lot better than what Naftali Bennett had when he
Well, exactly. But the mandate to form the government was Lapid's, and he couldn't form a government. So what did he do? He cajoled Naftali Bennett to defect from Netanyahu's right-wing camp by offering him the only position that he could possibly offer him to make him defect from the camp, which was prime minister himself. Yeah. And so they put in a prime minister that had only 5% of the popular vote, which is a clear violation of Israel's democratic spirit, at least,
Yes, they did it legally. We have to make that clear. It was a legal move, as was, by the way, Ariel Sharon's move when he wanted to disengage from Gaza. And he said, okay, I'm going to ask my party, Likud, for a referendum on this. And Likud rejected his referendum. So what did he do? In the middle of the night, he formed a new party, and he called it Kadima, and he went ahead with it. Now, what he did was legal. These guys are surrounded by,
legal
lawyers.
Experts, right?
Yeah. It was legal, and so was Naftali Bennett and Lapid's maneuver, legal. But it was not in the spirit of the election. It was not in the spirit of the voters' will.
Right, and then in a complicated rotation agreement that Bennett and Lapid signed, when Bennett ultimately resigned, triggering the fifth election cycle because the bare minimum majority could no longer hold. They couldn't pass any laws. They couldn't survive no confidence motions. The agreement basically triggered Yair Lapid to come in and become the caretaker interim prime minister before the election. And that's the first time that you've ever had a scenario where the caretaker prime minister was not the previous prime minister, right? A caretaker prime minister means that an incumbent sits in office until a new government is formed. However, Lapid was the first person to become the prime minister in such an arrangement. And then instead of just conducting the urgent and necessary affairs of state, he actually used the prime ministership as a platform to convince the Israeli electorate that they should vote for him. And
only that.
And overstepped several boundaries diplomatically, including signing a highly controversial maritime border negotiation deal with Lebanon, where we essentially gave a very large natural gas reservoir over to Lebanon, which is
really Hezbollah, the terrorist organization that runs Lebanon.
Correct. And I think that if Lapid had somehow managed to pull out this election, you can look back on that deal and say, well, he won the election. He would have done that anyway. So, there's nothing to really discuss. But now that Lapid is going to be sent back to the backbenches of the opposition, knowing that he wasn't the prime minister at the beginning of the last administration, and he sweeps in as a caretaker, signs a deal that Netanyahu would never have signed in a million years.
And by the way, appointed a chief of staff of the IDF. And let me tell you, the moves that he and Gantz made were very dubious because, and here's the thing, they had the backing of the courts because the courts hate Netanyahu and are engaged right now, actually in a witch hunt against him. That's a separate issue right now. But what is true is that they basically, they almost like stole through this in the middle of the night. They didn't present the controversial deal you're talking about to the lawmakers, to the Knesset. They didn't let the draft be read.
And the reason why they didn't do it, because it would have failed.
It would have failed.
It would not have passed.
So they said, and then they had the nerve to say that the reason they didn't want to show it to the Knesset is because if we had had a different opposition, then it would be okay, but we have an irresponsible one. In other words, we don't like Netanyahu's camp, and so we don't have to show them.
I mean, more simply, we know that the Knesset will vote this down, so we're not going to bring it to them.
But also on the grounds that they don't deserve. They're not good guys, so they don't deserve it.
Even though they're the democratically
elected body of the parliament, yes.
Right. So
Yes.
You have a situation where really the pot is calling the kettle black. Those that are subverting Israel's democratic principles and procedures are now accusing Netanyahu and his partners of being undemocratic when it was the electorate that put them into power in this hyper-democratic system that we have, where we now have had a fifth election. But the electorate really has spoken up in a strong way and rejected the moves that Lapid made.
So now, what are the critics in the media saying? The critics of this move, first they were saying it's a slim majority, and it was, that somehow it's hinting that it's illegitimate somehow. Now that they're seeing that that's not actually true, they're saying the electorate stinks.
Right.
The electorate is bad and racist and autocratic. So now the voters are to blame. See, our whole country stinks. It's not just this government.
So,
in other words, thank you very much, Haaretz and other news outlets here. And I will name them by name because they hurl personal insults at people like me.
So what do you think are going to be first of all, before we get into the policies, what's the process? How does the government get formed now? It's not simple business in Israel.
No, but this time it may be simpler than it was last time for sure, because this isn't, the process is such. First, we have to wait till all the votes are counted. And once all they're counted, we'll see exactly how many people, what number of seats each party has in the final analysis. When that happens, which may be finalized on Sunday, I don't know, could be tomorrow, could be Sunday. When that's final, then Netanyahu and the parties get together and decide he has to decide who's going to be what minister. He's going to divide portfolios. And there are going to be some arguments because Likud, that's the biggest party, and it's his party, will want the best ministries. And the religious Zionists will say, hey, listen, buddy, we got you elected. Thanks to our 14 seats, you're now prime minister, and you better do right by us and give us the ministries we want. And there's going to be a lot of that. There always is, by the way.
That's the horse trading that's typical of coalition
That's right. And
negotiations.
then let's not forget, ambassadorships. There's all kinds of things that are a way of, let's say, appeasing your disgruntled members of your own camp who are disgruntled because they were loyal to you, and then suddenly they want their job. They want a good job too, and now you mean you're going to give it to a different party when we're your party? So
Right.
There's going to be that.
In Israel, the cabinet, which is the executive branch of the government, is actually filled by members of the legislative branch. And we do have something called the Norwegian law, which would allow a Knesset member to resign their parliamentary seat if they take a ministership, which can get more people into the government.
Knesset.
But you don't have, by and large, professional appointments for cabinet secretaries like you have in the United States.
Right.
It's political appointments, and that all gets negotiated. But by and large, you only have 4 parties that are going to enter this government, and they're 4 parties that desperately want to sit together. So it should be easier to get them to...
Definitely, because, these guys, at the moment anyway, everyone, this is very unusual. At the moment, they're on one another's side.
Right. And the other 3 parties, aside from the Likud, which is a clear ruling party and has been a ruling party in Israel since Menachem Begin in the late 70s ruled the party. The Religious Zionist Party, the Shas Party, the United Torah Judaism Party, they're traditionally smaller sectoral parties, and they have their interests. For example, housing is very important, to the Orthodox community. So it'll be easy for Netanyahu to say, okay, you can be the housing minister. For the religious Zionists, for them, building infrastructure in Judea and Samaria is very important. Okay, you can be the transportation minister. It won't be difficult.
And by the way, Bezalel Smotrich was transportation minister, and he did a very good job, too.
Right. Now, Itamar Ben-Gvir is put on the table that he wants to be the internal security minister, and I think that given their surge in the electoral results, that there might be a good argument for him to get that.
I think there's a great argument for it, because for one thing, and as Netanyahu said, the choice ministries, in other words, defense, foreign affairs, there are certain ones that are considered the cushy ones. Those
will probably stay in the Likud.
Yes, those will. He said they will. But public security, he didn't mention that one. And the truth is that Itamar Ben-Gvir, I think a lot of people would be happy to see him as public security minister in charge of the police. There is such chaos right now, and he wants to restore, again, this idea that he's a loose cannon and all he wants to do is shoot everybody is not true. What he wants is to empower, re-empower the police and the army to do its job and back it up in doing that job. Their hands have been tied so many times, and he wants to give them back. Similar things happen in America with the police, and it's the defund the police movement. Here, you don't need to have that movement because the policemen don't have a big budget anyway.
Well, you don't have a defund the police movement here, but as you see in America and in American cities, there's less incentive for police to step in when crimes are taking place. And here in Israel, the rules of engagement have made it much more difficult for police officers and soldiers in the military to act when crimes are taking place or when acts of terror are in the formative stages. Right, you have to almost wait until someone is in the act of attempted murder before you can take action. And one of the things that Ben-Gvir is pushing for is to loosen the rules of engagement, to give police officers and soldiers immunity if they do act in the heat of the moment, because you're talking a lot of times about split-second decisions. And if police officers or soldiers know that left-wing court system could throw them into jail, for acting 1 second too soon, then they hesitate to act and actually put their own lives on the line. And so what Ben-Gvir is saying is that, we have to protect the lives of our police officers and our soldiers over the lives of the terrorists or those that are criminals, and those that are presenting themselves as potential criminals and potential terrorists.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And it's resonated a lot with Israelis.
It has, because, for decades, I have to say, when my kids went into the army, the thing I said to them, before they got on the bus to go off to basic training, each one of them was, listen, I'd rather visit you in prison than in the graveyard.
Right.
Because even then, we know you got to take a law book with you when you go fight in Gaza or something.
Right.
It is insane.
Right. And so we've seen really a rise in terror in Israel in the last year. The Netanyahu years, by contrast, were among the more quiet in Israeli history. And in particular, which is very interesting, is that the years in which Netanyahu served alongside a Trump administration
Yes.
in Washington, whereby the Trump administration was defunding the Palestinian Authority, had shuttered a consulate to the Palestinian Authority, had expelled the PLO mission from Washington, D.C., had defunded many of the NGOs that do the bidding of the Palestinian Authority and the international community, that terror against Israeli citizens was at all-time lows, which basically goes against many of the predictions that the left wing would have given you. They would say, well, you got
Remember the predictions that when Trump moved the U.S. Embassy to Jerusalem, there's going to be, and they were saying Jews are going to storm the Temple Mount, and they're going to be riots. Nothing. Not a riot.
So, for several years, we've had unstable government alliances, either where Netanyahu was forced to govern with, members of the left wing, or in an interim capacity. And then this last alliance where you had right-wing parties, left-wing parties, an Arab party, all trying to sit together with the only uniting bond being their hatred for Netanyahu. Do you think that this government that Netanyahu is on the cusp of forming could last an entire term?
Well, his government in 2015 lasted an entire term till 2019.
Almost.
Almost.
Right.
Almost, right. I'll say I think there's definitely a possibility. The internal fights I might anticipate come from, again, to use an America analogy, there were the Republicans and then there were the anti-Trump Republicans. Now there's the left who all hated Trump, but there were the conservative, anti-Trump conservatives. Now, I anticipate this coming from a different direction. I know many voters who voted either for a religious party or for Ben Gvir and Smotrich, and they also hate Netanyahu the way that some of the conservatives in America hate Trump. They hate Netanyahu from the right. They say that he promised to extend sovereignty over Judea and Samaria and didn't do it. Now, I have to say, they're wrong. And why are they wrong? Because he was going to do it, and as part of the Abraham Accords, he held off on it and signed very, very crucial peace deals that will enable this in the future. So I anticipate that some of the people who are in his coalition, the fights are going to be on things like that, when he says it's not the right moment, or something like that, and then there is going to be some kind of backlash. It doesn't mean that the government will fall.
Right. Netanyahu is the most experienced political player on the field.
He really is.
For now decades. Probably will have a much easier time enforcing discipline in a coalition with his right-wing ideological partners than he would be with Benny Gantz or Yair Lapid if he formed a centrist government. And I think that people especially in the United States, that would, who would prefer to see Netanyahu govern from the center, have to understand that Lapid and Gantz don't want Netanyahu to be the prime minister. So if they join a Netanyahu-led government, the whole purpose of their joining that government,
to be subversive, to topple it.
Right, would be to find the opportune moment to topple that government and
That's
to trigger a new election, which might get them
That's
back
right.
into power. And so for the purposes of electoral stability in a very complicated parliamentary system that demands a majority coalition, you have to have ideologically aligned parties sitting in government, because
Yes.
if you don't, you're going to have political crises every day. And what's happened in Israel over the past several years is that the prime minister, whether that was Netanyahu, and Naftali Bennett saw this in just a year in office, is that you wind up spending half of your day at least figuring out just how to keep your coalition together. And that's not really what you want your prime minister doing. I mean, Israel lives in a very dangerous neighborhood. We're in a global economic downturn. There's a lot at stake here in the Middle East and in the state of Israel in particular. And what you want is a stable government where ministers can work strategically on the various areas that they all need to work on in order to advance Israel as an emerging superpower, and not to be caught up in this continuous cycle of coalitions on the brink of collapse.
Absolutely. Now, another factor that will contribute to this, I think, in a helpful way, is the outcome of next week's
U.S. election.
midterm
Right.
elections in Congress. Because if there's a Republican majority in the House and the Senate, that means that's also indicative of a sentiment in the United States towards Israel and towards Netanyahu as the leader of Israel. It is important. It's helpful because Netanyahu, if he needs to address the international community, let's say on Iran again, the way he did in 2015, Obama was livid that he was invited, that Netanyahu was invited to address a joint session of Congress. And too bad. In other words, we need, right now, especially with what's going on in Iran and what's going on in Ukraine, and what's going on behind the scenes with Saudi Arabia. It'll be very important to have a Republican majority Congress and a Likud-led Israeli government.
Right, and I think that one of the things that actually made Netanyahu into one of the greatest prime ministers in Israeli history was his ability to sort of stand up against the will of the international community and to state Israel's case. And in many ways, it was his standing up to President Obama, which was one of the foundational elements that led towards the signing of the Abraham Accords agreements, because they saw that if the United States was no longer going to be a reliable force in the Middle East, that who is the reliable force in the Middle East? And wow, it's Israel that's acting against, to prevent a nuclear Iran, that it's Israel acting against the spread of ISIS in Syria and other places. And so they had every interest for their own security as well as their own economic interest to align with the state of Israel. And what you've seen in the last year, in which Naftali Bennett was the prime minister and Yair Lapid was the foreign minister and then became the prime minister, is that before Israel would do anything, they were, checking to see whether the Biden administration would approve or not, and that forced Israel into a position where they were basically a puppet state, a Middle East puppet of the United States, and that has led to the slowing of the momentum of the Abraham Accords.
Definitely. It totally has. And by the way, Netanyahu, you say that he knew how to stand up to Obama, and he did. But he also knew how to cave to Obama when he thought that it was in his interest. And a great example of that is Turkey. Obama got Netanyahu on the tarmac of Ben Gurion Airport, handed him a telephone and said, you call Erdogan right now, apologize. Now, Israel had nothing to apologize for the Mavi Marmara incident,
right,
the flotilla,
that's when
Free Gaza flotilla incident in 2010. That was Erdogan supporting Hamas. The flotilla was on its way to Gaza with arms. But Netanyahu conceded. He did it. He did what Obama told him to do. I remember at the time being furious at Netanyahu for his doing that. Okay?
Right.
So, but the point about him is that he picks his battles.
Right.
And the timing of his battles.
Netanyahu, in the beginning of his second term in office, agreed to a 10-month freeze of building in Judea and Samaria, which did not score many points with his right-wing constituents. But he did it in order to show good faith towards Obama. And ultimately, when that good faith wasn't returned, he refused to renew that building freeze. And ultimately, even though it wasn't a great move from the point of view of his right-wing constituency, it was a temporary move. And building was able to continue after those 10 months. So, Netanyahu is a statesman. He's a chess player. He's playing four-dimensional chess.
He's an amazing chess player. And by the way, anybody who's read his
Memoirs.
Newly released autobiography can see he describes that game of chess very well. And listen, he's got his flaws. He's not unlike a lot of his fans who sing King Bibi. I don't believe in anointing a human being of any kind, and hero worship is not appropriate in this case. What is appropriate is recognizing the incredible skill he has in this realm. That is necessary to recognize it. It doesn't mean that you have to bow down to him like he's a royalty or something.
Well, I think what's even more important is that what this election showed is that most Israelis think that he is the most qualified to be the prime minister, and by a large margin.
Large.
Yair Lapid had an opportunity to demonstrate to the first Naftali Bennett had an opportunity to demonstrate to the electorate that he was the man who could be the successor to Netanyahu. His government was a failure, and he ran with his tail between his legs. He just resigned from politics outright. And then Yair Lapid had an opportunity to demonstrate for a couple of months that he was a qualified candidate to be prime minister, and the electorate handed him a resounding no. The Yesh Atid party coming in 8 seats smaller than Netanyahu's Likud, and the left-wing bloc, that change bloc, coming in 15 to 20 seats lower, depending how you count, than Netanyahu's right-wing bloc. So the electorate has really stood up and ended the electoral deadlock, and ultimately that's what is supposed to happen in a democracy, right? Each time the parliamentarians failed to do what they were elected to do and to form a coalition, the mandate got handed back to the people, and the people, I think, stood up yesterday very clearly and said, we know that you guys are not going to solve this issue,
Yeah.
right? And we have to do it ourselves. And so the members of the right stood up and said, we're going to pull out every last vote that we can to the booths, and they did it in resounding fashion.
No question about it. And it was actually a very optimistic moment when you saw that 71.3%, I believe, was the final voter turnout. That's very high.
That's a almost historic high. I think the highest turnout since at least 1999.
Yes, it's very high in the Western world. It's high, and that's encouraging. That's good.
Right,
It
and
means
Israelis
people
are-
care.
right.
We care, and we're going to do it. And it's true that a lot of them had to be coaxed, told, come on. It does.
But Israelis
matter.
are also savvy, right? They understand the political game in Israel.
Yeah,
The
that's
news
true.
here in Israel that everybody consumes on a nightly basis is constantly talking politics.
That's right.
Politics is like the national sport in Israel.
That's right.
And so Israelis understood the stakes, they understood the personalities, and they did what they had to do in order to break the electoral deadlock.
Oh, absolutely. And, I think that for anybody who has gone into mourning, and, as happens very often, we have a lot of people here saying on social media, that's it, I'm packing my bags and I'm leaving the country. And, first of all, they never do it, unfortunately. Sometimes they want to say, good, bon voyage. They don't do it. But what they do is they try to, they cast a pall over everything.
And I think more important, when you look around at some Israelis that live abroad, you actually hear more and more of them saying, I'm thinking of moving back to Israel. It's not that Israel's getting unbearable. Looking around what's happening in Europe, looking what's happening in the United States today and in American cities, Israel, by many respects, looks a lot more stable in comparison, even though we've had this ongoing electoral deadlock. But as I said last night at the end of the broadcast, I don't think that the electoral deadlock that we had was a reflection of the instability of Israeli society, which is what the left wing has been trying to convince the electorate over the last several years. That Israel is a stable society, and there's a lot of elements of Israeli society that are worth emulating, and that is one of the reasons why Israel's diplomatic standing has increased so dramatically during those Netanyahu years.
Absolutely. We're incredibly healthy society, in spite of all the insanity, and we're filled with it, in spite of, we've always had a problematic microeconomy, even when the macro is doing really well. Though we are startup nation, we still have very primitive, for our own inventions are used all over the world, and we can't afford them or use them. But it's so healthy that on election day yesterday, when people were tearing out their hair on both sides, But in particular, on the left, where they were really feeling like they're about to go into mourning, I happened to be walking through Tel Aviv, the streets of Tel Aviv, where mainly are anti-Netanyahu voters, and everybody was out at bars, drinking, eating. Every restaurant was packed.
Packed yesterday,
People were
yeah.
standing on the street, schmoozing, chatting. I didn't even hear the word election.
And yet everybody still went out to vote as well.
They went out to vote, and they also went out to have a good time.
Which is what Israelis like to do. And I've had a good time sitting here with you this last hour.
As have I with you.
And looking forward to what the next weeks, months, and years will bring to the state of Israel and the Jewish people. And I
Amen.
want to thank all of the listeners for joining in this intimate conversation here in the JNS studios in Jerusalem. And we look forward to speaking to you again soon. Thank you so much.